Hey everyone, welcome back to On the Defense, the podcast where we look at the intersection of cybersecurity and finance. That intersection couldn't be clearer in this episode because we were very lucky to be joined by economist Alex Koutalistras from Oxford Economics. Alex has worked with a broad range of clients and partners, including AustCyber, and has done a lot of analysis of the actual costs of cybercrime. And as you'll hear from Alex, those costs are a lot more wide-ranging and severe than we sometimes talk about. It's a fascinating conversation that gets into both the dollar amounts as well as the broader impacts to things like mental health. Now, in this episode, we do say a couple of acronyms that I'm just going to explain off the top, but they'll also be in the show notes. So the first one is DDoS. That's a distributed denial of service attack. And what it is referring to is a cybercrime in which the attacker deliberately floods a server with traffic in order to make it inaccessible to users. If it's done unintentionally, we sometimes call that an internet hug of death. Fun fact. Now, the second acronym is APT. That's an advanced persistent threat. This is typically referring to a very sophisticated threat actor, often state-sponsored, and usually they have infiltrated a system or network and are just kind of hanging around there without anyone knowing about it. Creepy. Anyway, those are the acronyms. Let's get into the conversation. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to talk to you today. We've got a lot of different things to talk about because I feel like this topic is something that is very near and dear to the hearts of our audience because many of them are finance leaders. So they are very concerned with the numbers, with the economics of this. So I'm really excited to kind of dig into the work that you've done because my understanding is you've done a lot of work on the economic impacts of cyber incidents. And so I'm hoping you can give us an overview of your role, Oxford Economics, and the type of research you've done around this area, in specifically talking about cyber incidents and the economic impacts of them.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for having me on the show, first and foremost. And it's great to hear that cyber incidents and the economic impacts of cybercrime are something that your people are listening to and are really interested in. But my role as an economist at Oxford Economics, I'm in the applied economics team here. So I'd say that my role is quite broad, but ultimately it stems down to problem solving using economic frameworks. So often some of our clients want to know the kind of impact they are having on the community or the economy in dollar terms, or in the case of the government, what the impact is of a specific kind of activity or sector. So for example, that could be the cybersecurity sector, cybercrime, even something else like retail or defense. So we have done this kind of work for a variety of different industries and businesses, from construction to cultural institutions to social media, even retail.
That breadth of organizations that you're working with. So does that mean that you've seen kind of like a big variety of types of cyber incidents and types of impacts?
Yeah, often when we speak to these clients, they want us to solve specific issues for them. But cyber incidents have come up in almost all of our conversations with clients. You know, we spoke to a variety of different people, from even TikTok to construction industries to construction companies, I should say. Yeah, even companies like Woolworths. And all of these businesses are having to deal with cybercrime in some way. So it's something that we really need to tackle sooner rather than later.
Yeah, definitely. And have you seen an uptick in these conversations about cyber incidents? Is it becoming more prevalent? Is it something that your clients are thinking about more and more?
It's definitely something people are thinking about more and more, but I feel that there is a difference between thinking about it and then actually doing something about it. Often people are hesitant to, put their money where their mouth is and actually invest in cybersecurity platforms to, prevent this kind of malpractice occurring in their business. And ultimately, we just want to get this message out there and say, look, protect your people, protect your business, invest in cyber systems because it's really worthwhile.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's probably why your work is so important, because sometimes I think when leaders see, the dollar amount of, it would cost this much to invest in a security platform or a certain control procedure, it feels very daunting. Like, that's so expensive.
Yeah, we've had that conversation many times, yes.
But then when you are doing your work and you're analyzing this, I think it's so important to be able to see, well, there's a dollar amount to not taking action as well.
Indeed.
So let's dig into more of this because I'm very excited. I know that sounds a bit macabre. Maybe that's wrong of me, but I feel like it's so important to actually get some clarity on this. So I'm wondering, across the research that you've done, the analysis that you've done, did you often focus on any particular type of cyber incident?
So we didn't specifically target, X cyber incident. What we wanted to really understand was the kind of ramifications of cyber incidents as a whole, you could say. So often what we do is we send out a survey to many different businesses. We did this in the case of AustCyber, which was only last year, when we put together the sector competitiveness plan for them. We worked with them. We sent out an industry survey, and we were able to gather some really valuable insights in terms of what are the kinds of cyber incidents that you are facing, whether it's phishing, or phishing is the most common one, I honestly think. In that survey, we found that phishing was the most common. But also all other kinds of incidents, even DDoS attacks, are there DDoS attacks occurring? But in terms of the research that we have previously done as well, so we've been working with the Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure in the UK for quite a long while now. And the research into crime policy that we did as part of that research, I feel is quite invaluable. And a lot of the frameworks that we used in our analysis were based on many, many years of economic research, even stepping back to the 1960s when Becker released his very famous paper on crime and economics. So yeah, that was also quite interesting. So we found a lot of valuable insights from that too.
Wow. Okay. And I'm wondering if you can explain the type of costs that you had to look at. So I've obviously, spoiler alert to the audience, Alex and I have spoken previously, and I've had a look at some of the work. But I'm wondering if you can explain for the audience the types of costs that you were looking at. So you said that you wanted to see the overall economic impact. So is there a way that you can were there, categories or different stratifications when it comes to the economic, the bottom line, the cost, the dollars that were going into a lot of these incidents? Can you talk about those categories?
For sure. I think maybe important to start sort of at the start and then get into that. But the start is that why do people even make these decisions in the first place? Why do we have cyber criminals? We have cyber criminals because they're incentivized to actually engage in this kind of activity. You could say that the benefits significantly outweigh the costs. So there's a chance that they might get caught, whether that's a 10%, 5% chance. They've internalized that chance within their mind, and they have acted because those benefits outweigh the costs. So just from that point, what are the costs that these people are actually incurring for society? I mean, that's your question at the end of the day. And of course, probably most of the financial professionals that are listening on the podcast would be thinking, all of the money that, I'm going to lose as a result of this activity. And of course, that's one of the costs. But what about the other costs? And in that research, we broke these costs up into, three sort of key types of costs. So the first are costs incurred in anticipation of crime. So these are things like security expenditure, insurance administration costs, and these costs fall mostly on the potential victims of crime. Right? So for example, if there was no crime out there, we wouldn't really have a cybersecurity industry, would we? So that is a cost that people have to incur to protect themselves. The second are the costs incurred as a consequence of criminal events, so such as property stolen and damaged. Even things like emotional and physical impacts are very important. Strain on health services. A lot of people get a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder as well. That we've talked to many people and they've said this, that their people are really suffering as a result of cybercrime, not just in terms of the financial, but in terms of their family relationships, their mental health. It really matters. So how do you put a cost on these things? And naturally, these fall mainly on victims, but also on services dealing with the consequences, such as, your health services. And the third are the costs deriving from the response to crime, so such as costs to the criminal justice system. And these fall mainly on the taxpayer.
Yeah, okay. I think those are really helpful classifications. I'm interested in the second one as well because I recently read a study where it said that the employees of organizations who had experienced some sort of cybercrime or some sort of cyber attack had lasting psychological impacts from that. And that seems like the sort of thing that would be really difficult to quantify when we talk about economic impacts. But those, maybe it sounds a bit dehumanizing, but employees are a resource for organizations. And so that's still impacting their resources, whether it's people or finances. And so I'm wondering what kinds of costs can come up, when employees are affected in that way. Does it have operational impacts?
Yeah, for sure. For sure it does. I mean, if a person isn't acting to, 100% of their mental capacity, their mental health capacity, their productivity is probably going to decrease. So their work is probably going to be of inferior quality than it would be, if they were in the right state of mind as well. So that's something to consider. So one way that economists actually, value these things is to look at, okay, you have a person that isn't being affected by these issues, and you have the same person in an alternative scenario that is being affected by these issues. Let's forecast their productivity, and then you can almost do a subtraction to figure out the kind of value that is being lost as a result of their mental health suffering. That's one way that you could do it. I know it's not really super emotionally driven, but people want to know about the numbers.
Mm.
A similar approach is usually adopted when you're valuing education. Say, okay, how do you value education? Well, you look at what the effect of an additional year of schooling is on future wages.
Yeah.
And then you're able to sort of work out what the additional value of education is that way too. So these approaches have been used. We do them quite often. But it's good to see that now they're coming to light, and they're at the forefront of conversation.
Right, yeah. And also, I'm kind of wondering, just because it's interesting to think about that first category of costs, the kind of anticipatory costs that you were talking about that, kind of go into some of the prevention. What are the differences when we look at those costs? Because we do have to consider, this is the impact of cybercrime. Organizations like F-Shore that exist to try and stop cybercriminals from getting money and data, et cetera. But do you see, organizations spending a lot on that first category? And does that, have you seen that it has impacts on the maybe the next two, those costs that come up when something does happen? How do leaders kind of weigh those costs and go, yeah, I know that there are potential risks with not investing in it, but how do you help them, I guess, balance that and kind of think, about that first category in the way that maybe could mitigate the other two categories?
True. I think that the first thing to understand is have a look at the data and understand, the scale of cyber attacks that have been happening over the past year. In our research with AustCyber, we found that the average size of a cyber attack in 2023 for a small business was around $55,000 worth of damages, right? Then for medium businesses, it was in excess of 90,000, and for large businesses, it was around 70. So these medium businesses are actually the ones that are being targeted the most by cybercriminals, and for good reason, because medium-sized businesses haven't really been, medium-sized businesses aren't actually prepared in the same way that larger-sized businesses are.
Yeah.
To this. They're not taking the forefront. They're not investing as they probably should be, because they have all of these overheads that they need to worry about, and cybersecurity and protecting their business is at the back of their mind rather than being at the front of their mind.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we see that often. Small businesses, especially when they grow rapidly, often security is one of the things that kind of takes the back seat. Well, then you've got a really soft target where they've got more and more resources and they're growing really rapidly, and maybe they've got a bigger client list and they've got more money, but they don't have those big security teams and some of the defenses that you might find at these like major global corporations. And so it totally makes sense that they would be a pretty attractive target, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
Speaking of size of organizations, my understanding is that you've worked with a diverse group of types of organizations, both, I think you kind of already touched on different verticals and different industries, but also, organization like sizes. But my understanding is that you've done quite a lot of work across UK, Australia. I'm wondering, are you seeing any similarities or differences between regions like, the UK, Australia, US? Do they have things in common? Are they radically different? What are you seeing in these different areas?
Well, I can speak to the UK and maybe a bit on the US, but we have seen that the threat landscape is extremely similar. Extremely similar through all Western countries. Right? Depending on the country, the economic impacts may differ slightly, depending on the demographics of the country. So the cost of health services is one of those things. So when we talk about, that second stage of crime, different health services in different countries have different costs. Right? So that's one thing. And even the legal system, we're often told about these big buck lawyers, living in the US, charging an arm a leg for legal services. So you can imagine that the costs in the US would likely be substantially higher, or the indirect costs anyway of cybercrime. But again, many of these costs often fall on the taxpayer. However, depending on the country, this will change. You may have quite a libertarian country that doesn't necessarily have a lot of tax subsidization as part of its economic framework, and all of those costs will end up being put on the consumer.
Right. Yeah.
So it really depends on the jurisdiction that you're talking about.
Yeah. It sounds like it falls on someone eventually.
It falls on someone,
and it's usually not the people committing the crimes.
Yes,
depending on how they manage those risks and those costs that you mentioned at the beginning. And so it sounds like my understanding of some of this work is that organizations, people, it sounds like they saw that as the asset that was most impacted during a cyber incident. I know we've kind of started to touch on this already, but can you go a bit more into that perception that you found in some of your survey respondents and whether, other research aligns with that? Are leaders correct that people and their employees are the asset that's often the most affected by cybercrime?
Well, certainly. I'd say 100%. When a business incurs a cyber attack, it affects the people, but it also affects the brand's reputation. And this is something that we also talked about in the previous work that we did. So if you look at organizations that have had cyber attacks, the people of that organization have that as a list of the people of one of the companies that they have worked in previously, right? So even being associated with a company that has had a cyber attack can be perceived by many people as a negative. So it's almost like your reputation is reflective in the reputation of your business. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, of course, the mental health strain of people that have suffered from cyber attacks. I think we touched on this. We touched on this a little earlier, but it's just tremendous. The amount, it's all new to us too. This kind of work hasn't really been discussed, but mental health costs in particular, as a result of cyber attacks, is something that isn't talked about enough.
Yeah, and that's I know that this is going to sound maybe a bit trivial within this context, but often, what we see at F-Shore, because we're looking at attempted fraud, business email compromise scams, that sort of thing. A lot of times you see, AP staff who maybe have fallen victim to a scam and they've transferred large sums of money to a cyber criminal in a scam that's very sophisticated. But often you see these people kind of, they feel terrible. They feel so guilty, and there's all this. There are mental health impacts, and then that also has this kind of diffused impact across all organizations and maybe all teams where everybody's just a little bit nervous all the time, where they go to, maybe process a payment or something, and they're kind of, even if it's a perfectly legitimate payment that they need to make, there's this something in the back of their mind going, what if I'm making a mistake?
Yes.
What if I'm about to pay a criminal $100,000? And so it's just this kind of like ambient stress of, what if I'm the one that makes the wrong move or gets swindled kind of. And I think I think it's really easy to underestimate the impacts of that to productivity, to morale.
Definitely.
Does that match with what you've seen?
100% does. No one has really talked about the mental health impacts of cybercrime and the productivity impacts of people that have suffered from cybercrime before. I mean, this is very new. So the fact that it hasn't been talked about before is, again, something to consider. So all of this is very new. So there isn't a lot of research out there that really kind of backs this up. That's why I can't really talk about it in much more detail. But it is there. It is there. And it's something that all financial professionals should consider. And this is why that they need to invest in proper cyber systems to protect themselves, to protect their business, and to inhibit their employees from suffering from this kind of thing.
Yeah, the stress is, I think it'll be interesting to see economists and other researchers who are looking at kind of like the macro sort of things. It'll be interesting, I think, over the next several years to see as awareness of cybercrime and cyber risks increases. It'll be interesting to see, what are the effects collectively on our stress levels, on our mental health and stuff? Because at one point it was kind of an ignorance is bliss sort of thing where the problem was that people didn't have enough cyber awareness. And as that awareness grows, I'm curious to see what organizations like yours are going to find in the coming years about the impacts of this on society, on the business community and everything. So that'll definitely be one to watch.
For sure.
And so I guess just pivoting slightly, we've talked a lot about so much of cybercrime is financially motivated. And, with a finance audience, we find that's often what our audience is mostly concerned about because they're the gatekeepers of their organization's finances. But I think sometimes it can be easy to overlook the fact that not all threat actors are financially motivated. And sometimes there's not always a bright line distinction between financial motivation and other types of motivation. So have you seen in the research that there are maybe state-backed actors or threat actors that have a mix of motivations? And, how is that? Does that have any impact on, does that have economic implications for why they're acting and who they're backed by?
For sure. And to put it frankly, state-backed APTs are much, much more dangerous in terms of economic costs, as their goal is not to just take money from your business, right? Their goal is to cause serious damage to an economic ecosystem. So that's the main difference. One company goes bust, it's like, okay, whatever. But state-backed APTs often want to just completely decimate an ecosystem. So that causes significant economic effects. Often they also don't target a specific business. They target a network. Their goal is to collapse economic function. These often take the form of DDoS attacks, as we all probably know, aimed at causing harm to the victims rather than being commercially lucrative for the attacker. Right? But the question that we need to ask is, how do we even identify what a state-backed incident looks like versus a syndicate-backed incident? Would a country ever own up to an attack? You don't see countries saying, yeah, that was me. So how would we find out? Or would they just pawn it off as some despicable act by one of its people?
And I also think that it can be very difficult because sometimes you see, like you said, I don't think nation states are going to be in a rush to say, yes, we did knowingly partner
Yes.
with this criminal syndicate, with these organized criminals in order to maximize the damage or in order to just kind of leverage some of the skills or the people that they already had. So I think there often are threat actors that are kind of these like hybrid, yes, they are crime syndicates, but then they're also working with a state. And so then, like you said, how do you even begin to differentiate between, there aren't these neat categories when you actually look at the real world?
It's extremely difficult to, and the international nature of cyber attacks as well really complicates the victim's understanding of the origin of any sort of attack. We have different cyber criminals operating in all of these different jurisdictions. How is a person supposed to know who's really attacking them, right? And the risk of punishment for state-sanctioned or state-sponsored cyber attacks is low in any event. And this is what our UK research found out. From what I'm aware of, there is yet to be an established universal cyber legal framework to depend on, right? And efforts to build international mechanisms for internet governments and cybercrime cooperation are still at an early stage, right? Bilateral action when cyber attacks do occur is heavily constrained by legal and diplomatic boundaries. So we talked about Becker's work.
Yeah.
And I think that really is at the forefront of crime economics. You can't send a country to jail, right? You can't send a country to jail. And there are constraints on any form of, I guess, punitive measure, right? At the same time, it's still useful in understanding the pervasive nature of cyber attacks. But a criminal who faces no sanctions is more likely to continue with their activities, and lacking an effective punishment, states might likewise be encouraged to attack other nations as well.
Yeah.
And, I'm not going to name names, but we have seen some countries that have, been engaged in these more than others.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's already complicated trying to, when we're just looking at just maybe say a rogue criminal, it's already so difficult to pursue anything there when you're looking at all these different jurisdictions and they're acting in a country where maybe the jurisdiction is, we're not going to be able to take legal action against them. But then it becomes so much more complicated when you factor in, geopolitical considerations and things like that, where maybe it's just, not in the nation's interest to actually act or to make a big kerfluffle about there being like a state-sponsored attack. But to bring it back a little bit to, for instance, business leaders, have you seen in your research anything around how leaders perceive those threats? Because I know often we hear, even when we're just talking about financially motivated crime, we hear so many organizations go, "Oh, we're not very big. Like, how would they even know we exist? Like, they wouldn't target us." Have you seen anything around leaders' perceptions around state actors? Because I feel like that could potentially be even more pronounced, that feeling of why would anybody care about us?
Honestly, we haven't heard about it at all, believe it or not. When we speak to people, they're not necessarily concerned about who is attacking them. They're concerned about if they are attacking them and what they can do to protect themselves.
Yeah.
is the primary thing. I mean, I think that the majority of people that we've spoken to never really even heard of the term, a state actor of cybersecurity. This is still really in its early stages. And for larger organizations, yes, I would say they have more of a grasp on the nature of, these cyber attacks, and maybe they're able to differentiate between who's attacking them because they have the resources at their disposal to invest in cyber systems. But when it comes to small and medium-sized businesses, we don't hear this conversation at all, which is even more of an issue considering that medium-sized businesses in particular are the primary businesses that are being targeted by these criminal syndicates. So it's definitely an important conversation to have.
Yeah, for sure. And okay, this is a bit of a broad question.
Love broad questions.
Yeah. It's a bit open, but I'm wondering, was there anything, you've done a lot of analysis, you've done a lot of research, you've worked across you've heard from so many different types of leaders and organizations. I'm wondering, was there anything in your analysis or in your research that surprised you, that made you go, whoa, I was expecting something different?
The primary thing that I found that really surprised me in particular were the significance of the indirect effects of cybercrime. We've spoken about this briefly, but the sheer amount of costs associated with one criminal activity is just immense. And honestly, investment in cybersecurity platforms, it really does pay for itself. The mental health costs, the legal costs. When you're talking about international jurisdictions as well, most of these cyber criminals are operating in, other countries, not the US, UK, or Australia, but other countries, right? So how are you going to get your money back? You need to invest a lot of money to try and get that back, or it's just been thrown down the rabbit hole. So that was the first thing that really surprised me. The second thing that really surprised me was the impact of reputational damage as a result of suffering from a cyber attack. So the work that we did in the UK in particular was really reflective of this. We noticed that when a company suffered from a cyber attack, it was reflected in a decrease in stock prices as well, right? So you can measure that kind of reputational impact. And naturally, that how are they going to communicate this with their shareholders? Well, for all of the financial professionals here, that research indicates that investment in cybersecurity is actually beneficial to shareholders because you're protecting their assets. So that's something that we also found quite interesting. And most recently, we saw this when it came to the Optus attack. I mean, we did this research before the Optus attack, but if you look at the perceptions of Optus as a brand after that attack, it dropped a little bit, and that was reflected in lower sales.
Yeah. And I think also something that doesn't get spoken about very much are the impacts to the employees. We've touched on this a couple times now, but just that, like I mentioned, that kind of ambient stress of something has gone wrong, something could go wrong, I am connected to this. And also still there is quite a lot of stigma, I think, around, now I understand Optus might be a slightly different situation, but, for instance, with Medibank and some of these other big cyber attacks, I think there's often still a stigma of like, oh, we got. We were pwned. That's on us. And so there's this almost kind of victim blaming thing where then gets kind of put back onto the employees where they go, oh, this is our fault. And now this reflects on my organization, it reflects on the brand, and it reflects on me as a professional. And I think I'm going to be very curious to see, you mentioned that this is such early stages, but I'm very curious to see what analysis might show in a few years from now, and what is that costing us in terms of mental health, and if we can quantify that, like what are the costs going to be, because it seems immense.
For sure, and we have been in conversation with the newly formed Australian Cyber Network, which used to previously be AustCyber, and we have a great relationship with them, and we hope that we will continue to do this kind of incredible work that we've been doing over the past few years with them in the future as well. And that definitely is something on the horizon, putting a value on the cost of cybercrime in terms of not just the financial, but all of the indirect costs as well. We're very interested in doing that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, sadly, it sounds like you're going to have a lot to analyze and a lot to look at, because it's just a problem that's not going anywhere anytime soon. So sadly, you're going to have a lot of interesting work to do, I'm sure. And so I'm wondering, if listeners want to find out more about the research and the work that you do with these different organizations, where should they go online?
I'd say the best place to look is on the Oxford Economics website. You can visit that, oxfordeconomics.com, and you're able to navigate through all of the different pages we have on there, even search up cybersecurity, and I'm sure you'll be able to find all of the interesting work that we have done in the field. We also do some really interesting work on AI as well, and looking at the intersection between AI and cybersecurity is another topic that we're really, really interested in exploring.
Yeah, so, yes. Amazing. And you specifically, not just Oxford Economics, if our listeners want to find out more about you and the work that you do specifically, where can they find you? Where can they go?
I think the best place would just be to send me a follow on LinkedIn or send me a connect on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to chat. Yeah, I'm really, really a talker. I'm happy to talk with anyone from different fields. It's kind of my job. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alex. This has been really informative, and I'm really excited to see the other work that you're going to do.
Great. Well, thanks, Shanna. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for listening to the latest episode of On the Defense. If you'd like to find out more about F-Shore, you can follow us on LinkedIn or head to www.fshore.com. Thanks again.